Hello, I'm Dr. Mike Darcy, and in today's lecture, I'm going to be talking about the brain, the human brain, and the nervous system. So, without further ado, let's get started. Okay. So what we have here is a human brain, a pickled human brain. As you can see, it's pretty much as you see in pretty much every documentary, every movie. Just in case you're unsure, this here is the front of the brain, and this is the back of the brain. This structure here is the cerebellum, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. I'll also be talking about the rest of the structures of the brain as we progress. I will also be discussing neurotransmitters and nerves, different kinds of neurotransmitters, etc. Okay, so what we have here is the brain stem and the diencephalon. So the brain stem begins at the top of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord moves up into the brain, and then we have the rest of the brain stem going into the middle of the brain. So let's go through some of the purposes of these structures. So first of all, right at the bottom of the brain, or the top of the spinal cord, depending on your perspective, we have the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, part of the brain stem. The medulla oblongata relays sensory information to the thalamus, which is the top of the brain stem, and to other portions of the brain stem. It's responsible for the autonomic nervous system. That's the automatic nervous system, a part of your nervous system that you have no conscious control over, such as breathing and heart rate, that kind of thing. Cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive systems. Above the medulla oblongata, also part of the brainstem, we have the pons. The pons relay sensory information to the cerebellum and to the thalamus at the top of the brainstem. It's responsible for subconscious, somatic, and visceral motor centers. Basically, when you go to sleep, you tend to not act out your dreams unless you sleepwalk. Even though the parts of your brain, the motor centers of your brain that control movement of your body, are active while you're dreaming, but the pons prevents those signals from going from your brain down to your limbs so that you do not act out your dreams. It's kind of like a sort of switch. Some of you may have suffered from a condition known as sleep paralysis. With sleep paralysis, you wake up and for a few moments, you're paralyzed. You cannot move. You're conscious, but you cannot move. I've had this myself as a child. This is caused by a fault in the pons. Basically, the switch closes when you go to sleep, but it doesn't necessarily open immediately when you wake up, and that delay leaves you conscious but paralyzed. This may explain that some supernatural experiences that people have, or people also that say that they've been abducted by aliens, because the way they describe these experiences quite often is that they wake up in the middle of the night, but they're paralyzed, and they see people, objects, aliens, devils, whatever, in the room with them. Now, this could be explained by a fault in the pons, together with the not being fully conscious yet, so dreams become incorporated in conscious experience. So that's a pons. Above the pons, we have the mesencephalon, It's responsible for processing of visual and auditory data. So visual and auditory data at a very low level. So basically, when signals come from your eyes and your ears, they go through this structure, and there is some processing that occurs there. It's not where you become consciously aware of sounds or images. It's at a subconscious level. This data then moves up through the thalamus and is transferred to the occipital lobe for vision and the temporal lobe for audio, for sound. But there is some awareness. For example, there's a condition where a person can be blind, but without any damage to their eyes. The damage could literally be damage to the occipital lobe, the part of the brain that is responsible for conscious sight, constant conscious vision. Now, if the mesencephalon is undamaged, then a person can still subconsciously be aware of movement of objects, of vision, basically. So, for example, someone with this condition, they may say that they cannot see, they're unaware of anything, but if you suddenly set fire to something close by them, they will be aware of it at a subconscious level, and the adrenaline can start to rush and they can start to panic. Also, if suddenly an object flashes close to their vision, they may blink in response to it, even though consciously they have no memory of seeing anything. So this is subconscious processing. And an animal such as a frog, that's all it's got. A frog, for example, is aware of movement at a very basic level, but doesn't seem to be aware of it consciously. So, for example, you can take a frog and you can put it in a cage and release some flies into the cage, and it will be aware of the movement, snap its tongue out and eat the flies. However, if you put it in a cage that's full of dead flies, it will sit there and starve to death because it's unaware of these objects, these flies at a conscious level. So mesencephalon processing of visual and auditory data, generation of reflexive somatic motor responses. So if suddenly an object rushes towards your eyes, you will pull your head back. That's subconscious. This part of the brain is also responsible for the maintenance of consciousness. So to be consciously aware rather than unconscious, asleep, this part of the brain needs to be active. It uses a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which I will talk about later. Damage to this part of the brain can result in a sleeping sickness. There's a particular parasite that is carried by a mosquito. And if you get infected by that parasite, you can suffer from sleeping sickness. There can be damage to this part of the brain, and a person can fall asleep, become unconscious, and have real difficulty coming back to consciousness. In fact, in some cases, people fall asleep and they stay asleep for years at a time when they suffer from this condition. So that's mesencephalon. It switches you between consciousness and unconsciousness. Then we have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, just above the hypothalamus, we have the thalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is sort of the link between your neuronal system, the brain, the nerves, and your hormonal system, which is primarily controlled by structures such as your pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus links the nervous system with the system of hormones that a person produces. I'm not going to go into hormones at any sort of depth in this lecture. That's for another lecture. Okay, so centers controlling emotions, autonomic functions, and hormone production. Then there's a thalamus above the hypothalamus. The thalamus, it's a relay center for the brain. Signals that enter the spinal cord, so nerves from all around your body, even from structures such as your ears and your eyes, they all end up entering your spine and going up through the spine to the thalamus. And then the thalamus relays those signals to the appropriate parts of the brain. So for sight, that would be the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. For hearing, the temporal lobe at the side of the brain, etc., etc. Okay, so that's a brainstem and the diencephalon. Now, on the brain itself, we have various structures. We have gyri and sulci. The gyri are kind of like hills, ridges that basically stand up from the brain. The sulci are small dips, depressions in the brain. The fissures are longer depressions. Okay, so this is the midbrain. It's an image of the midbrain. For anyone that's watching the video rather than the audio, I have a few images here of the brain itself. For anyone that's unsure how to get to the visual, the visual version of this, if you are listening to me on a podcast app, I also publish these talks on YouTube. So if you do a search for Science on the Edge, you'll be able to find the imagery that goes with the audio, although you should be able to get along with just the audio for the most part in this lecture. Okay, so the midbrain, associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep-wake, arousal, alertness, temperature regulation, contains structures such as the substantia nigra, which basically pigmented cells. The substantia nigra are a bunch of cells in the brain that produce a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, if you suffer from Parkinson's disease, what's happened is the cells of the substantia nigra in the midbrain have started to die and degenerate with age. And as they die, they stop producing quite so much dopamine. And without dopamine, you have no drive, no function. You cannot move your body in a controlled manner. You have no ability to direct your actions. Severe Parkinson's disease results in death. I should say there's a treatment for Parkinson's disease. There's a drug called L-Dopa, which is an artificial version of dopamine that patients can take. Now, when you take L-Dopa, it works for a while, but unfortunately, the body eventually develops a tolerance and the drug stops working. The younger you are when you develop Parkinson's disease, the more likely you are to rapidly become resistant to the L-Dopa. But L-Dopa is very, very useful still. Another treatment for Parkinson's disease that's quite new involves stimulating the neurons of the substantia nigra with small electrodes. And it does seem to work quite well. You can see YouTube videos of people with Parkinson's who are shaking quite a lot. They've had the implant of the chip into their brain. And then as they switch it on, you see the hands slowly stopping the shaking and the person stands up. It's really quite amazing to see. Okay, so the thalamus processes, distributes almost all sensory motor information going to the cerebral cortex, regulates levels of awareness, emotional aspects of sensation as well, the emotion associated with a particular sensation. Hypothalamus regulates the autonomic nervous system, secretion of hormones. Basically, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases 9 separate hormones that control other glands in the body. Everything from growth hormone that controls height, all the way through to things such as FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, which control the male and female reproductive systems. So homeostasis is maintained by the hypothalamus, a steady state in the body. There are extensive connections between the hypothalamus and the thalamus, midbrain, and some of the cortical areas of the nervous system. The pituitary gland, and if you are watching the image, you can see the pituitary gland just here, hanging underneath the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is about the size of a bean and produces 9 hormones that control all aspects of our bodily systems, let's just say. The cerebellum. The cerebellum is known as the little brain. The little brain, the structure here at the back of the brain, hanging underneath. It looks like a brain all of its own. It's divided into several lobes and receives sensory input from the spinal cord. So the sensations you feel from your balance system, from your arms, from your legs, from proprioceptors and other types of receptors within your body, they send the signals up to the cerebellum, receives motor information as well as sensory information from the cerebral cortex, and receives inputs about balance from vestibular organs of the inner ear. So its purpose is to control fine movements of the body, fine repetitive movements. So for example, it coordinates planning, timing, patterning of skeletal muscle activity during movement, but not initiation. So you decide to do something. So for example, perhaps I decide to stand up. Now, standing up is quite difficult. Keeping yourself on 2 legs without falling over involves a lot of fine movements of the muscles in your legs, in your arms, in your torso. And you don't control those consciously. You just send a signal to your cerebellum saying, okay, I'm moving now, I'm standing up. And the cerebellum deals with the fine motor control. It also deals with things such as language. When you first learn how to speak, you have to concentrate on how you move your lips, how you move your tongue to say a word. But once you've learned how to do it, it becomes subconscious and the cerebellum takes over the function. So the frontal lobe, this is where you plan things. That's in charge when you're learning a new activity. But once it becomes automatic, that is your cerebellum. It's the same with typing or with playing the piano. When you learn to play the piano, you have to think about where every finger goes. But once you've learned that particular skill, it's your cerebellum that takes over, and you just decide, I'm going to play, and your fingers seem to do it all by themselves. It's not all by themselves, it's your cerebellum. Riding a bike is the same. Many other activities that become automatic. Driving a car, you don't think where your feet are on the pedals once you become proficient at driving, but you do when you're learning. That's because your cerebellum takes on the task. So coordination of head and eye movements, maintenance of posture, etc. Damage to the cerebellum results in loss of precise motor control. Alcohol affects the motor functions, for example. The forebrain, the telencephalon. The forebrain is the largest part of the brain. Consists of the cerebral cortex, the outer part of the brain, and underlying white matter. White matter are neurons whose axon, the axon is the long part of the neuron, is covered in a substance called myelin, a sort of insulating substance that allows the neurons to fire more efficiently. There are also glial cells in the white matter. Glial cells, which I'll talk about later, are a type of cell that supports the neurons. They're a little bit like a neuron. They look a lot like a neuron, but they're not a neuron as such. They're not the neurons that deal with thinking. They feed, they support the neurons, and they also remove waste products. Some of them fight infection in the brain. They help the neurons. They help the brain itself to function better. There are three functionally related deep-lying clusters of neurons in the telencephalon. These are known as nuclei. The basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. These are structures I'm going to talk about shortly. The cerebral hemispheres are divided by a fissure from front to back. So you have a left brain, you have a right brain, and there's a huge fissure down the middle. A number of connecting axons go from left to right of the brain, therefore allowing the brain to function as one unit. And these neurons are known as the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. They move signals between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. Both hemispheres are concerned with perceptual, cognitive, and higher motor functions, and also emotions and memory. The basal ganglia. Looking deep in the brain, you see the nuclei known as the basal ganglia. These are masses of grey matter found deep within the cortical white matter. The main components are the corpus striatum, the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, and the putamen. And then you also have the globus pallidus. I'm not going to talk about what each of these structures do right now, but they're involved in things such as desire and habit, subconscious activities such as habit, action selection, decision making, certain behaviors. Basically, these structures, whether they fire more or less, are responsible for things such as having an addictive personality. Are you more likely to get addicted to something? Less likely. It's all controlled by structures such as the caudate nucleus and other structures within these nuclei, these basal ganglia. So habit formation, things that you like, things that you don't like, whether you like this, whether you don't like this, a lot of that is controlled by the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia. For the people looking at the YouTube video, this is a section of the brain showing that when you cut the brain, you have every structure on both sides of the brain. So everything that's on the left is also mirrored on the right. They're not identical, but they're the same sorts of structures. So you have two sets of everything in the brain. Now let's talk about the hippocampus and the amygdala. So the hippocampus is Greek. It means seahorse. For people looking at the visual of this, you'll see it looks a little bit like a seahorse in the middle of the brain. I think it looks more like a big snake in the middle of the brain, actually, but hey, it's the hippocampus, seahorse. Now, the hippocampus and the amygdala are part of a structure in the brain known as the limbic system. The limbic system, it influences the endocrine and autonomic nervous systems. Endocrine means the hormonal system. So the limbic system controls certain hormones that you produce, and also certain nervous impulses. For example, the amygdala, which I was going to talk about the hippocampus first, but let's talk about the amygdala part of the limbic system first. The amygdala is a little lump at the end of the hippocampus. Now, the amygdala is responsible for sensations such as fear and anger and sexual arousal. All of these things are controlled partly by the amygdala. So, for example, when a person is angry or fearful and you perform a scan of their brain, you see a lot of activity in the amygdala. If someone, however, is feeling very calm and relaxed, there is very little activity in the amygdala. For example, if you take violent criminals from a prison, and this has been done, and put them in a brain scanner, you tend to see a lot of activity in the amygdala. Whereas when you take a Buddhist monk, someone who's used to meditating and calming their emotions, and you put them in a brain scanner, you tend to have very little activity in the amygdala. Meditation calms down the amygdala because, and as a result, it calms down sensations such as anger and fear. The amygdala also links memories with certain emotions. So if you have some sort of phobia, if you're scared of a particular, I don't know, a snake or a spider or being in crowds or whatever it is, then what's happened is the amygdala is linked with the memory sections of the brain, and it's linked to certain memory, a certain sense, a certain environment with the emotion of fear. And therefore, when the memory is activated or you're in that environment again, stimulates the amygdala, which starts to fire, and the amygdala has a connection with the adrenal glands. So it causes the production of and release of adrenaline. So this is how you can associate fear with a particular memory or a particular environment. The hippocampus is responsible for the formation of long-term memories. It's also implicated in the maintenance of cognitive maps for navigation. So, for example, in London, if you want to become a registered Hackney taxi driver, then you have to pass a test called the knowledge. You spend about a year learning every street and every corner of the Greater London area. And then in your test, you have to sit down and the instructor will say, okay, I'm in this part of London, Marble Arch, and I need to get to this other part of London, Sturton Street in Woolwich. How do I get there? And from memory, the person has to know how many lefts to take, how many rights, how long it will take, every single street and corner. So basically, you need to create a cognitive map of the entire of London, which is difficult to do. And many people have real problems basically with passing this test, with learning the knowledge. Okay, so the hippocampus is responsible for formation of long-term memories. If your hippocampus was removed, you would still have short-term memories, but you would not be able to create any long-term memories. An example is of that is going to be in the next slide or two, but just to overview it, if someone was to come into the room and talk to me and I had no hippocampus, I could have a conversation with that person for the duration of the time they were in the room. But then if they left the room and came back in a few minutes later, I'd have no memory of ever talking to them. So the hippocampus is incredibly important for memory formation. The limbic system, highly interconnected with the nucleus accumbens, the brain's pleasure center. So nucleus accumbens connects with the hippocampus and the amygdala, and that's so we can associate particular things with a sensation of pleasure. So if you've never drunk any alcohol, then you don't have any sensation of pleasure associated with it. But if you've drunk alcohol and you enjoyed the experience, what's happened is your hippocampus has created a memory. That memory is of the drinking of this alcohol, and the amygdala has associated a particular sensation with it. And if that sensation was pleasant, the nucleus accumbens remembers that sensation and stimulates a feeling of pleasure. So the nucleus accumbens is the brain's pleasure center, and it links with the hippocampus and the amygdala to allow individuals to to seek out certain behaviors, to enjoy certain things, or to avoid certain things. There's a role in sexual arousal, and the high derived from certain recreational drugs. Nucleus accumbens is linked with all of that. So a heroin addict has a big link with the activity of taking drugs and injecting them, and the sensation of pleasure. The limbic system is also connected to parts of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. This is Henry Molaison. Henry Molaison suffered from severe epilepsy, and a surgeon, this is going back to, I believe, the 1950s, a surgeon decided to treat this condition by removing Henry's hippocampus. At the time, they did not know what a hippocampus was for. They found out pretty quickly, though, because when they removed the hippocampus, Henry no longer was able to form long-term memories for the rest of his life. So he had the operation when he was quite young, but for the rest of his life, he was unable to form new memories. Scientists worked with Henry for the next 50 years of his lives, but every time these scientists came into the room, they had to introduce themselves to him again. What's quite interesting is, while Henry was being experimented with so that we could learn more and more about how memories are formed, the scientists had an interesting idea. They decided to teach Henry how to perform certain repetitive tricks, such as drawing around a star-shaped object through a mirror. Now, which is very difficult to do because your hand has got to move in the opposite direction to that you would think it would. And it's very difficult to learn. However, having had Henry try this trick over and over again for quite a long period of time, he became very, very proficient in it, so that you could just give him the star and the mirror and he could draw it perfectly. Now, the thing is, Henry had no memory of ever doing this, of ever performing this task, yet he could do it seamlessly as if he'd practiced, which he had. And the reason for that, as you probably guessed, is because as he was learning the action, this was the frontal lobes of his brain in action, but when it became an automatic task, the activity had moved to the cerebellum, and his cerebellum was undamaged. So there's more than one type of memory. Hippocampus deals with forming long-term memories, whereas the cerebellum can control motor functions, fine learned motor functions. The cerebral cortex, the largest part of the brain, 83% of its mass. The outer structure of the brain is the cerebral cortex, and it's divided into different structures, such as the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. Controls higher mental functions, including all conscious thoughts, experiences, and intellectual functions. Now, for the people viewing this on YouTube, I have a picture of a human cerebral cortex and a rhesus monkey cerebral cortex. The main difference, apart from the sheer size difference, the human brain is much larger, is that the cerebral cortex of a human brain is folded. There's lots of folds on it. There are very few folds on the rhesus monkey brain. The reason for this is, by folding the brain up, you can take a very large object, a brain, and fit it into a relatively small object, a human skull. So it's just a matter of having a greater surface area in a smaller volume. The anatomy of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. It's a folded structure. The folded structure increases surface area. It has elevated ridges known as gyri, shallow depressions known as sulci, and deep grooves known as fissures. Whereas the grey matter is the cell bodies, the neurons, the bits of the brain that are doing the thinking. They're found in the cerebral cortex and in the basal nuclei deep in the brain. There's also the white matter. These are the fiber tracts, the axons, the wires that connect different parts of the brain together. The white matter basically are myelinated fibers. So think of them as big, long neurons, nerves. The long part is the axon, and it's covered in a white material known as myelin, which is an insulating material that allows these neurons to fire more efficiently. Now, there are different types of white matter, these big long fibers connecting different parts of the brain. First, we have the association fibers. These are bundles of axons within the brain which unite different parts of the same cerebral hemisphere, so the same side of the brain. They are subdivided into the arcuates, which are local fibers. They are small fibers which connect two parts of the brain on the same hemisphere that are very close together anyway. Then we have the longitudinal fibers. They are longer. They connect one part of one hemisphere of the brain with another part that's quite a distance away. Next, we have the commissural fibers. They connect the two hemispheres of the brain, the left and right, together. These are the commissural fibers. And finally, we have the projection fibers, which project downwards. They link the cerebral cortex with the rest of the central nervous system, the rest of the brain, and the spinal cord. There are four main lobes of the cerebral cortex. They deal with sensation, communication, memory, understanding, and voluntary movement. There's a temporal lobe for memory and hearing, the frontal lobe at the front of the brain, so temporal at the side, memory and hearing, frontal lobes at the front, executive function, problem solving, language, that kind of thing, decision making. Parietal lobe at the sort of back and the top, well, middle to the top. The parietal lobe gives you a sense of self, And then there's the occipital lobe, which deals with vision. I'm going to stick on the parietal lobe for a brief second, just to explain this concept of sense of self. Basically, there is a scientist, a Canadian scientist known as Persinger, and Persinger has invented a device which has been nicknamed the God helmet. He places this helmet on volunteers, and it interferes with electrical communication between neurons at the sort of junction between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, so roughly that part of the brain. And it interferes with those neurons firing. And in many of these subjects, when this device is activated, they lose their sense of self. They do not feel centered in their body anymore. They do not feel like an individual. They feel like they're part seamlessly of the world around them. They expand out of their body. And they don't feel like an individual. So it shows you that the sense of even something that you consider so central to your individuality, a sense of self, is just a bunch of neurons firing, and it can be interfered with. Okay, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later, maybe. Okay, moving on. The functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So for people watching this on YouTube, there is now an image of the brain showing the different structures of the brain. There are three types of functional areas of the brain. The motor areas, which control voluntary movement, sensory areas, which are responsible for conscious awareness of sensation, and the association areas. These integrate diverse information. So association areas take information from different parts of the brain and they bring it together. They associate it so they can integrate the information. Okay, frontal lobe, responsible for cognition, higher level of thinking, certain emotions, and behavior. Phineas gauge shows what can happen if you get damage to the frontal lobes. So Phineas Gage was a railway worker back in the 19th century, and he had an accident. And a metal rod basically was blown by dynamite through the frontal lobe of his brain. So this metal bar went right through the left frontal lobe of his brain and shot through the other side and was deposited a few meters away. Now, weirdly, Phineas survived. It's shocking that he survived this event, considering there was no antibiotics or antiseptics or anything like that at the time. But he did survive, but his personality was very different after the accident. Before, he was known as quite a quiet, well-behaved, reliable man. Afterwards, he was known as impulsive, a bit of a drunk, completely unreliable. It partly shows you what the frontal lobe is responsible for. It allows us to control our behaviors. So the emotional parts of our brain, structures like the amygdala, caudate nucleus, nucleus accumbens, all those structures are generating all these emotions, these desires, and we can control those with our frontal lobes. This is one of the reasons why children are so much more impulsive than adults. When you're a child, you have a fully developed amygdala, for example. So you're quite capable of feeling fear and anger and all those emotions. However, your frontal lobes are not developed, which means you find it very hard to control your impulses and your actions. You have a desire and you act on it. Your frontal lobes take quite a long time to fully develop. They only fully develop in your 20s, sometimes quite late in your 20s. That's why more mature people tend to have better impulse control. They have more control over their emotions. You take an 18-year-old at university, there's an exam in a couple of days, he knows he should study, but there's a party on tonight. He goes to the party quite often because his frontal lobes are not developed quite enough yet to suppress his more basic impulses and urges. Whereas a mature student is far more likely to resist the urge to go to the party. Temporal lobe, responsible for memory, emotions related to memory. So it's not just memories in the temporal lobe, it's also the emotions that are related to memories. So this association between particular memories and certain emotions, part of that is worked out by the temporal lobe of the brain at the side. The parietal lobe gives you your body image, integrates sensory information from the somatosensory cortex of the brain. Gives you a feeling of self. The occipital lobe is vision. The occipital lobe at the back of the brain is responsible for vision. It's divided into lots of different sections. For example, one part of the occipital lobe deals with identifying movement, another with depth, another with light and dark, another with boundaries between objects. And it's all integrated together to give us vision. The cerebellum, as I mentioned earlier, sequenced learning, balance, voluntary movement, coordination, timing, and posture. That's all controlled by the cerebellum, the little brain. Now, for the people watching this on YouTube, the next couple of slides, which I'm very quickly just going to jump through, just show you that there are different subdivisions of the brain. Lots of subdivisions of the brain. So there isn't just the frontal lobe, for example. There is the middle frontal gyrus, the superior frontal gyrus, the inferior frontal gyrus, the orbitofrontal cortex, the inferior frontal sulcus, the superior frontal sulcus. All these different parts of the frontal lobe are responsible for slightly different things. They're all involved in decision making, but in very different ways. So we have lots of different substructures of the brain. And these substructures, they talk to each other. So we have lots of various substructures of the brain, and they integrate information together to form our behaviors. There are many, many different structures and junctions. The junctions between different lobes of the brain are quite interesting areas because that tends to be where a lot of information is linked together. So, for example, the primary visual cortex is in the occipital lobe, but visual object perception occurs more towards the side of the brain, so parietal temporal lobe area. Guiding movements in sequence and space, again, controlled by other parts of your brain. So the occipital lobe has to talk to other parts of the brain in order to understand what's going on. Now, again, for the people watching this on YouTube, there is an image here of what we call an homunculus. There are two strips of the brain. In the middle of the brain, going down on either side, we have the somatosensory cortex and the somatomotor cortex. The somatosensory cortex, the strip of brain at the side, you could almost draw a body on it. In fact, that's what they have done with creating the homunculus. So, for example, if you feel a sensation on your left big toe, then there will be a part of your somatosensory cortex at the side of your brain what that signal will be perceived in. So the signal will start from the toe, go up through a sensory neuron into the brain, and in a particular part of the somatosensory cortex, a few neurons will fire, and you'll perceive that as your left big toe being touched. Whereas another part of your somatosensory cortex, for your right big toe on the other side, there is a part of it responsible for any sensations coming from your leg, your lower leg, your upper leg, your fingers, your tongue, your mouth, your lips. Every part of your body you can map onto the somatosensory cortex. And there is different amounts of the somatosensory cortex devoted to different body parts. So, for example, humans use our hands a lot, and we use our mouth a lot for talking, for eating. We manipulate tools with our fingers. So there's a huge part of our somatosensory cortex devoted to the hands and the mouth. But there's very little dedicated to, say, the lower back, because we don't really use our lower back to perceive things. So different parts of the body are represented by different numbers of neurons in the somatosensory cortex, with the parts of our body that we use more being represented by more neurons. The same is true of our motor cortex. So the motor cortex is again a strip of the brain next to the somatosensory cortex. When we initiate movements, we send the signal from a particular part of our motor cortex to the part of the body that we want to move. And there's a different part of the motor cortex responsible for different parts of our body. So if I want to move my right foot, I send a signal from the neurons in my somatomotor cortex that is responsible for my right foot. The signal will go down motor neurons to my foot, and I will move the foot. Again, different parts of our body have a different amount of neurons devoted to them. So there's a huge part of the motor cortex responsible for our hands, our tongue, things like that, our mouth. Very small amounts are dedicated towards our feet and our lower back. We don't need to move them quite as intricately as we move our fingers and hands and mouth. Here's an example of some localization of brain function, language. Primarily localized in the cerebral cortex. There's two areas of the brain that are important for this, the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area, which I'm now going to talk about. First of all, I'll give you a term, aphasia. An aphasia is a term used to define any language disorder resulting from various medical problems. So you have an aphasia if you have some sort of language problem. In 1861, Pierre-Paul Broca described a patient who could understand language, but was not able to speak in full sentences or express ideas in writing. So he had a motor impairment of language. When this person died, he was autopsied and his brain was analyzed, and it seemed that he had damage to parts of his brain known as the Broca's area. Obviously, it wasn't known as that before, but afterwards it was. So quite often, if there is damage to the Broca's area, there are problems basically with producing language. The ability to produce language is damaged in some way. In 1876, another scientist, Carl Wernicke, described an aphasia with impairment of comprehension rather than execution of speech. So this person could not understand language, even though he could make all the relevant sounds. Again, upon examination of his brain, it turned out that part of his brain was damaged, and this part of his brain later became known as the Wernicke's area. So this is where word recognition resides, or at least partially. Obviously, these areas all interconnect, and they interconnect with association areas around them as well, so that you can bring all this together to understand and comprehend and use language. So now let's move into some of the general subdivisions of the nervous system. So the nervous system itself can be divided, first of all, into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system are all the nerves that are present in the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system are all the nerves that leave the brain and spinal cord to connect to other parts of the body, the heart, the lungs, the arms, the legs, everything. So the peripheral nervous system, all those nerves that are outside of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system can be divided in two as well. The first division is the somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic branch is responsible for any conscious movement of the body. So if I choose to move my hand or my mouth or my body, that is my somatic nervous system. It's a part of my nervous system I have conscious control over. Then there is the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for all the automatic nervous transmissions. So, for example, controlling your heart rate, your breathing, the movement of food through your gut by the stimulation of smooth muscles around your stomach and intestine, process known as peristalsis. So the autonomic nervous system regulates glands, blood vessels, and internal organs. But the autonomic nervous system is once again divided in two. It's divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Basically, sympathetic means stimulate, parasympathetic means inhibit. So all the things you control automatically, like your heart rate, your breathing, all of these things, they need to be sped up and slowed down depending on needs. If you stimulate part of the autonomic nervous system, you increase its rate of activity, then that is a sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. If you inhibit it, then it's a parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So once again, nervous system divided into two, the central nervous system and the peripheral. Central nervous system is the brain and the spine. Peripheral is divided in two, the somatic, which is under conscious control, the autonomic, which is automatic, subconscious. The autonomic is divided into sympathetic, which stimulates things, and parasympathetic, which inhibits them. The brain, I hate this analogy a lot of the time, but it's sort of relevant in a way. The brain is sometimes described as being a little bit like a processor, like a central processor in a computer. That analogy falls apart in many ways, but in some ways it is. There is input, signals that come into the brain from the sensory neurons. So our eyes contain sensory neurons which fire in response to light. We have thermoreceptors, which are sensory neurons in our body that fire in response to heat. We have proprioceptors, which fire in response to movement. We have nociceptors, which fire in response to damage. We have all sorts of different sensations, sensory neurons in our body. Those signals go inwards in a direction known as the afferent direction into our central nervous system. And when these signals get to the relevant parts of the brain, they are processed, and in some cases stored as memories. And when they are processed, there is then a decision that's made, how to react. And then there's an output, signals that leave the brain via the motor neurons to the muscles of the body to cause something to occur. So sensory neurons detect things and send the signals to the brain. Then we have something called interneurons, which are all the neurons within our brain that make the decisions, that process the information, decide what to do. Then we send signals out through the motor neurons to our body to act out the decision. So there are three processes: perception, which is mediated by specialized receptors linked to sensory neurons; information transfer and processing, mediated by billions of neurons within our brain; and output, exert control of body movement. This is controlled by motor neurons in the brain. Here, for the people watching this on YouTube, there are two images, one of the sympathetic nervous system and one of the parasympathetic nervous system. Very complex systems. The nerves leave the spine, go to different parts of the body, and allow us to perceive our environment and to react to it. So the general principle of connectivity. Sensory neurons sense things, and then when they fire, they send signals in an afferent direction to the central nervous system. Within the central nervous system, we have interneurons, which are the neurons that do the processing. Then a decision is made and signals are sent outwards in the efferent direction via motor neurons to different parts of the body. So for example, you touch something hot, it stimulates thermoreceptors, sensory neurons in your finger. Those signals go up through the sensory neurons to your central nervous system. They connect with interneurons. The interneurons then process the information, make a decision, and then when the decision is made, impulses are sent via motor neurons down to the muscles, which then can contract and perform a response. So you touch something hot, the end result, you pull your hand away from the hot object. There are different classifications of neurons, and they can be classed structurally based on the number of processes, axons and dendrons. So an axon, a neuron basically will receive information from other neurons. There can be thousands of neurons connected to one neuron. And when the neuron receives information, it receives it through its dendrites, these small projections. Then the signal is sent through the neuron via a axon, a big long cable, think of it like that, like a long wire. And then at the end of the neuron, and the neuron could be very long, it could go from the foot to the tip of the foot to the spinal cord. At the end of the neuron, at the end of the axon, you have axon terminals which connect with other neurons. So there's three general classifications of neurons. The vast majority are multipolar. So they basically have they have dendrites at one end with a cell body, a big long axon, and then axon terminals at the other end. But we also have bipolar neurons where the cell body is sort of in the middle. We have dendrites at one end, axons at the other, cell body roughly in the middle. Then we have, so these bipolar neurons, they're for special senses such as vision and hearing. Then we have unipolar neurons. These tend to be sensory neurons. So here the cell body sort of sticks out from the side of the neuron, again with the dendrites at one end and the axons at the other. Next, we have the glial cells. I mentioned these earlier on. They're sometimes referred to as neuroglia. Glial cells are smaller than neurons, but greatly outnumber them. The glial cells support the neurons. They feed them, they protect them, all sorts of things. So think of your brain as a big collection of normal, everyday neurons that do the processing, but around them are all these glial cells that support and feed them. So they insulate, they form a blood-brain barrier, they separate the blood system from the circulatory system from the brain. They provide nourishment to the neurons via producing cerebral spinal fluid. They support them, they protect them. So certain glial cells perform phagocytosis, meaning they can eat bacteria and other damaging particles in the brain. Remove debris, and they provide stem cells. So some glial cells can mature and divide to produce new neurons when that's necessary. So again, for the YouTube viewers, here are some pictures of different glial cells and their function. You can look at this in your own time, but I should say I'll mention one of them. I won't go through every one, but there's a type of glial cell known as an astrocyte, which is sort of, well, it sort of resembles a star, and they are the most abundant of the glial cells. And they're the first type of cell to die when an individual develops Alzheimer's disease. Basically, they die and they're no longer able to feed and protect the neurons, so they die too. So the synapses. When one neuron ends, there is a gap between that neuron and the next neuron, but they need to talk to each other. One neuron can communicate with thousands of other neurons via these connections. The end of the axon terminals of one and the dendrites of the next can connect, but they don't touch each other. There is a space between them. This space is known as a synapse. It's a space between two neurons. The gap is sometimes known as a synaptic cleft. It is in this space that the neurotransmitters are released and bind to receptors on other neurons. So when one neuron fires, so for example, a sensory neuron in your foot that goes all the way up to your brain, then when it gets to the brain, it releases at the end a neurotransmitter, which goes through the space between that neuron and the next, binds to a receptor on the next neuron, and maybe stimulates it to fire. So neurotransmitters are the signaling molecules between one neuron and the next. So let's briefly go through some of these neurotransmitters. There are many of them. So your neurons produce lots of different neurotransmitters. Some individual neurons produce several different neurotransmitters. Different neurotransmitters do different things. They also do different things in different parts of the body, but generally within the brain, they act as follows. And within muscles too, depending on the neurotransmitter. So acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It stimulates. It triggers muscle contraction and release of some hormones. So if I send a signal down through a motor neuron from my brain to my arm, to my bicep, then that neuron, that motor neuron will connect just above the muscle, release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which will bind to the muscle and cause it to contract. So it's a stimulatory neurotransmitter. It's involved in wakefulness, attentiveness, anger, aggression, and sexuality. Acetylcholine has many functions. Then we have dopamine. And dopamine is an inhibitory transmitter in some cases, involved in controlling movement and posture. It modulates mood. It's involved in positive reinforcement and dependency. Addiction. I mentioned Parkinson's disease sufferers have a deficiency in dopamine. The treatment is used to give them L-Dopa, artificial dopamine. One side effect of L-Dopa can be an increase in addictive behaviors such as gambling, showing you the importance of dopamine. The dopaminergic system, dopamine basically, is involved in all sorts of reward behaviors. So when a person drinks alcohol, smokes cigarettes, takes all sorts of different drugs, in many cases it's a dopaminergic system that is stimulated. Okay, GABA. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It contributes to motor control, vision, and cortical function. And it regulates anxiety, calms us down. So parasympathetically. Glutamate. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter associated with learning and memory. Some people take supplements of glutamate to try and help with studying. The evidence as to whether that works or not is a bit flaky, but glutamate itself is involved with learning and with memory. Norepinephrine. It's important for attentiveness, emotions, sleeping, dreaming, and learning. It also causes blood vessels to contract and the heart rate to increase. Also plays a role in mood disorders. Imbalanced levels of norepinephrine can result in all sorts of mood disorders. Then we have serotonin. Serotonin contributes to functions such as body temperature regulation, sleep, mood, appetite, and pain. To give you an example, the drug ecstasy, MDMA, what it does is it causes huge amounts of serotonin to be released from your neurons into the synaptic cleft. And for any of you that have taken this drug, you will realize that the sensation you feel is one of empathy. You feel connected to the people around you. So it shows you the importance of serotonin. Low amounts of serotonin are linked with conditions such as depression and anxiety. And drugs such as Prozac, they work by increasing the amounts of serotonin in the brain. There are over 60 different molecules that can be considered neurotransmitters. I've just talked about a few here. So let's summarize some of these structures before we conclude for the day. Brain anatomy. There is the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. Brainstem controls breathing, heart rate, sleeping, alertness. Cerebellum controls balance and coordination. The cerebrum, cerebral cortex, consists of the somatosensory functions, and there is also the somatomotor cortex there too. The cerebral cortex, higher functions, larger in humans than in animals. On average, actually, there are animals such as the blue whale, which has a brain much larger than a human. It's all about relative sizes, though. The last part of a brain to develop, so it's more sensitive to environmental influences. So when we talk about nature and nurture, what part of you is down to your genetics and what part is down to environment? Well, because your cerebral cortex develops as you grow up, the environment has a much larger impact on the development of the cerebral cortex than on other parts of the brain. There are 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, behind the forehead, conscious thinking, planning, inhibition, delayed gratification, attention, reasoning, decision-making, strategies, goal setting, self-monitoring. all controlled by the frontal lobes, the left and right. The parietal lobe at the top of the head contains the somatosensory functions. Temporal lobe above the ears, language and hearing. Occipital lobe at the back of the head, visual processing. And then there are several association areas that associate input from different parts of the cerebral cortex so that you can work out what's going on. Lateralization. So we have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, they are mirror images of each other in many ways. However, they are slightly different. They are slightly different. So the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and receives input from the right side of the body. The right side of the brain controls movement of the left side of the body and receives input from the left side of the body. Traumatic brain injury to one part of the brain will affect one side of the body. So, for example, if part of the motor cortex on the left side of the brain becomes damaged, then you may lose the ability to move part of the right side of the body, become paralyzed, and vice versa. Also, if you have part of the sensory cortex, say on the right side of the brain becoming damaged, then you may lose sensation on part of the left side of the body. Now, there is a certain amount of specialization. So the left side of the brain, on average, and it varies a lot, is more responsible for language and logic, mathematics, those sorts of things. The right side of the brain, more responsible for creativity, for artistic impulses, for music, that side of thing. But it does vary, So left hemisphere, language and analytical thought generally. 90% of right-handers have language functions focused in the left hemisphere, but only 60% of left-handed people have language functions in the left hemisphere. So it's not complete. It's not complete, but there is a certain lateralization. The right hemisphere is more responsible for spatial and holistic thought. In normal populations, there's sort of division of labor between the left and right side of the brain. If you have a traumatic brain injury where the left and right side of the brain are completely separated, which can happen in certain circumstances, you can end up with two people basically in the same head, which shows you that each side of the brain has got all the abilities necessary to exist as an individual. Your brain acts as one because the two sides of the brain are constantly talking to each other through the corpus callosum, these commissurial fibers that connect the left and the right side of the brain. I'll give you an example of what can happen if the left and right side of the brains are separated. So a person could maybe, so you could take a picture of something, for example, elephant, and you can sit a person down and position them so that only the right side of the vision can see the elephant on the left, or only the left side of vision can see the elephant on the right. Remember, one side of the brain receives sensations from the opposite side of the body. If you do this, let's start. So, for example, you show a picture of an elephant so that it's on the right visual field, meaning only the left side of the brain sees it. And then you ask the person, what did they see? They will say an elephant, because the left side of the brain is responsible for speech, and it saw an elephant. If, however, you place it on the other side, the left side, so the right side of the brain sees it, and then say to the person, what did you see? They will say, I didn't see anything, because the left side of the brain didn't see anything. However, if you place a pencil in the left hand, which is controlled by the right side of the brain, and then ask them to draw what they saw, they will draw an elephant. So two individuals in the same brain. This can be really quite traumatic. There have been incidents where a person has tried to punch someone with their right hand and then tried to stop themselves from punching with their left hand. The two sides of the brain acting independently in the same skull. Or, for example, a person puts a shirt on to go to a job interview. Now, the left side of the brain wants to go to the job interview. So the right hand is basically buttoning up the shirt. But the right side of the brain, which controls the left hand, doesn't want to go to a job interview. So it starts unbuttoning the shirt. There's two people in your head, two different people. They act as one because the left and right hemispheres are connected. But if you disconnect them, you are no longer one individual. In many cases, you are two individuals. Brain circuits. basically, when you perform a particular activity, it's never just one tiny part of the brain that fires. There are always multiple regions. Almost always multiple areas, circuits become active. A certain circuit will be active when you perform one task. A different set of brain regions will be active when you perform a different task. Blooming and pruning. Blooming. Children have many more synapses and neurons than do adults. Synaptogenesis between birth and age 3, there's a big blossoming of new neurons and new connections. There's a rapid proliferation of synapses, connections. There is 100 billion neurons in your brain and trillions of connections. And when you are young, there is a blooming of these connections. But then there is a pruning. Synapses disappear if not used. You might think this is a bad thing, but there's some evidence showing that this process of pruning is necessary to allow the brain to function efficiently. For example, people with autism seem to have a problem with this pruning process. The formation depends on chemicals known as neurotrophins. So neurotrophins are released by neurons and allow new neurons to grow and to form connections. In the cortex, pruning extends into adolescence. This is known as the sculpting process, as your brain becomes more well-formed. Think about it like a big lump of clay, and then parts of the clay are removed to sculpt a shape, a form from that amorphous mass. And experience helps with the sculpting process. Other developmental changes. As you grow up, there is increased myelination, so the neurons can fire more efficiently just before birth and into the 20s. There is maturation of the frontal lobes well into early adulthood. Brain development and experience. Okay, any normal environment with the right visual perceptions and exposure to language, etc., will allow the brain to develop in certain ways. The earlier that you experience certain environments, more likely they will be to have a profound effect. So, for example, individuals seem to have a better ability to learn a language when they are very young. If they learn a new language later in life, they tend not to learn it fluently, or at least without getting rid of the original accent. So there's more plasticity when you're young. Plasticity is still present in adulthood, but it is there when you're young to a more larger degree. Experience, practice, environment have a huge effect on the development of the brain, but genetics is important too. You have a predisposition towards developing a particular level of IQ or ability with art or music or mathematics, but that can be influenced by the environment to an extent. It seems that a lot of human traits are about 50% controlled by the environment and 50% controlled by our genetics. Twin studies that have been identical twins that have been separated at birth, brought up by different families, have shown this to be true. Okay, so that's all for now. I've given you a kind of general overview of the brain. There's a lot more detail. One can take an entire degree in neurology, a PhD in neurology, in fact. So I've just touched the surface. I'll probably revisit this topic in more detail in the future. So thanks for watching. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter hashtag is @MarkOfTheD, MarkOfthe. That's all for now. Thank you very much for listening.